today, and now we're actually going to get into real content. So let's talk a little bit about this thing called the BRE, or Buyer Representative Exclusive. There are actually 3 buyer representation agreements, or what a lot of people like to call buyer broker agreements. I have them then now. They're now the buyer representation not for compensation. In my opinion, kind of a worthless document, because if you don't have compensation tied to an agreement, you really don't have a whole lot of damages if they breach that agreement. So stay away from that one. The buyer representation non-exclusive. The way this one works is if you have your buyer sign it and you show them a property and then they buy that property from somebody else, you're entitled to a commission. But if they go out and buy a property that you didn't show them or you didn't tell them about, then they don't owe you a commission. It's almost kind of like an open listing. And how many of you guys take open listings? Exactly. So stay away from that one. Now, I know a lot of agents are attracted to that one because I guess they think since it gives the agent less protection, that it's going to be easier for them to get the buyer to sign it. Well, you don't take open listings, you take exclusive right to sell listings, right? So if you're going to go to the trouble of getting your buyer to sign an agreement, you might as well get them to sign the agreement that's going to give you the most protection. And that's the whole idea. And that is why I recommend the buyer representation exclusive. Conceptually, it's like an exclusive right to sell listing, only it's with a buyer, not a seller. So when you enter into an exclusive right to sell listing with that seller, if that seller tries to sell that property to someone and deny you a commission, you have a right to get that commission. It gives you the most protection. Well, likewise, if a buyer buys a property during the term of your buyer representation agreement exclusive, you're entitled to a commission, whether you show them the property or whether you didn't show them the property. It ties that buyer up to you during that agreement's period. And that's the kind of relationship you want with a buyer. You don't want your buyer working with other agents. You want them to work exclusively with you. So I'm going to give you all an invitation to role play. Now, of course, role play is one of those things. Otherwise, when you ask most people, hey, do you like role play? Well, if they tell you yes, they're kind of lying. They say, or what they're really saying is, I like to watch other people role play, but I don't want to role play myself, right? So I'm going to make you the deal. The easy role in the role play is to be the buyer. So I'll play the agent, you can play the buyer. So as we go through this, and what I'm typically going to do is stop as we go through the form. If you see an objection that you're worried about, see, today I'm not just going to tell you what the contract says. I'll certainly do that, but I'm also going to show you how to overcome objections, because I know most of you would like to use this agreement, but you're afraid. And the reason you're afraid is you're afraid you're not going to be able to overcome an objection that a buyer may have. And my guarantee to you today is, at the end of this presentation, there is no objection you will not be able to overcome. All right? So that's my promise to you. Now, with the buyer representation agreement, there are 2 objections. With a listing agreement, there are actually 3 objections, right? When you go out and list a property with a seller, there are 3 objections that seller may have. The term of the listing. You want to take it for 6 months, they want to give it to you for 45 days, right? Second, the price. You want to list it at market price, and that seller wants to overprice it. And third, commission. They want to reduce your commission. So you have 3 objections with the listing agreement. With the buyer representation agreement, you have 2 objections. The first is commitment, committing themselves to work with you exclusively. And the second objection is commission. They're worried about having to pay you a commission. And I'm going to show you how to overcome both of those. All right. Now, when you go out on a listing agreement, you're going to give a presentation to that seller. And that's going to last what, maybe 45 minutes, sometimes 2 hours, right? I mean, certain listing appointments go longer than others. You're going to have to introduce the BRE to your buyer. And that's what I talk about with an introduction script. I'm a big believer of scripts, not in the dogmatic Mike Ferry method, but a script gives you an idea of what you're going to say, an outline. For example, before I go into a class, I have an outline of what I'm going to talk about. Before I teach this class to you, I have an outline. It's the PowerPoint, right? So I know, not only do I know what I'm going to say, I have it in front of me so I don't miss anything. So here's your introduction script to say to a buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, looking forward to representing you in the purchase of your new home. You know, buying a home is probably one of the most exciting things a person can do. It's also a sizable investment. So if you're feeling a little intimidation as you go through this process or a little nervous, that's perfectly normal. And I want you to feel comfortable in sharing your feelings with me so that we can overcome any concerns that you might have. Now, I know there are some buyers out there that say, you know, I hear of agents that will just show me properties. And you're asking me now to sign an agreement with you. And I will say to them, yes, I am. And the reason is this agreement, the BRE, is a contractual agreement between the two of us that authorizes me to represent you in your real estate transactions. And again, this transaction may be one of the biggest purchases you've ever made. And I think it's important that you have a representative. You have someone looking out after you. You know, sometimes a buyer will tell me that they will call the name on the for sale sign of a house they're interested in because somehow they think they're going to get a better deal. And I need to let them know that what they don't understand is that seller has entered into an agency agreement with the agent's name you see on that sign. And that agent's job is to get the seller the best deal possible. They're not representing you. They're representing the seller. You know, it's kind of like if you were charged with a crime, would you want the district attorney to represent you? No, you'd want your own attorney. You'd want your own attorney to protect your rights. And in purchasing a piece of real estate, in purchasing your home, I think it's important that you have your own agent there to protect your rights, to represent your interest, and to get you the best deal. Don't you agree that's important? And of course, they're going to say yes. And they say, exactly. That's why I want to enter into this agreement. So I am authorized to protect your rights, to protect your interests. So again, you present this contract as a way that you are now authorized to get them the best deal, to look out after their interests. That's what buyers want. That's what buyers need. Now, before you enter into an agreement with your buyer, you have to disclose agency. Now, know with sellers, before you take that listing, you have to give them an agency disclosure form. It's required by law. Civil Code 2079 states that you must disclose agency before you enter into an agency relationship. Now, this is not a contract. This is simply a disclosure. So the seller must sign this form before they sign a listing. Your buyer must sign this form before they sign the buyer representation agreement. Failure to do so defeats your right to a commission. States it right in there in 2079.14. If you do not give a buyer this agency disclosure form, then you're not entitled to a commission. You forfeit your right to a commission. So please make sure the buyer signs this form first. Second, I think you're all familiar with the possible representation of buyer and seller, the PRBS. Now, this form also should be signed by your buyer right after the agency disclosure form. What does this form do? Well, it does two things. First, it says to the buyer that You may be representing other buyers who might be looking for a similar property, and that's okay. Remember, agency is determined by your brokerage company, and if you're trying to find your buyer a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in Walnut or Chino Hills, there's probably an agent in your office who's also looking for a similar property for their buyer, right? Is that a dual agency situation? No, but it's a little dicey. So CAR has created this form to say that it's okay that your agency or you do that. The second thing it says is if you have to go into dual agency, it's okay. Here's the scenario. You get ready to write an offer on a listing that's listed by somebody else in your office. And when you go into that agency confirmation on the contract, you have to tell them that your brokerage is going into dual agency. And that buyer looks at you and says, no, no, no. I read something on the internet that says I shouldn't be in dual agency. I should stay in single agency. I don't want to go into dual agency. Well, now what do? You're stuck, right? I mean, refer that buyer to somebody else in a different company? No, you don't want to do that. So this form says that if you have to go into dual agency because your buyer wants to make an offer on a listing that's listed by somebody else in your company, it's okay to do that. So it's very important to have this form signed. Now, I know a lot of you know situations where this form gets signed in escrow. Why? Well, because your file's not going to be complete and your broker's not going to pay your commission, right? But it's such a waste because once you're in escrow, it's too late. You already got a deal together. This form doesn't do you any good. So since you have to get the forms done anyway, remember, the agency disclosure form is required by law. This form is not required by law, but it is required in the contract. Purchase agreement requires this form to be used. Therefore, let's get it signed where it does you some good. Get the agency disclosure form signed first. Get the PRBS form signed second before you start showing the buyer property. So even if you decide not to use the buyer representation agreement, if I can give you one thing to take out of this class, have your buyer sign the AD form and have your buyer sign the PRBS form before you start showing the buyer property. It's going to protect you and it gives value to these two forms. Now, we're going to go into the BRE. Before we do that, I don't see any questions in the chat. Actually, we may have one here. Let's see. Thank you, Raymond. I'm glad you liked the Mount Sac real estate program. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to take some breaks, mini breaks for questions, and then continue on through the class. If you have a question, type it into the chat. I will get to you. If you think about something later, don't worry. At the end of this class, I will open it up for questions. I'm actually going to ask Laura to unmute all the mics so we can actually have a conversation. But let's keep our mics muted as we go through. That way I can get through the material. So what I've done in this PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint's available to you, Laura's happy to mail it to you. We're going to look at the overview of the page, and then we're going to go into the individual, if I can get back to the screen, sections. All right, so exclusive right to represent. So we're going to put down the name of the buyer or buyers that may be involved in the transaction. This could include parents, grandparents, and uncle if they may be going on title to help get the loan approved. So again, anybody that may be going on title, you want to include them down as the buyers. If you need more room, you can always add the addendum. And then grants to your broker. Remember, not you. Your broker is the true agent, so you put your brokerage name on the next line. For that purpose, I'll say Mount Sac Realty, right? And then we have our contract term. Now, remember I said this is the first objection. Your buyer is going to be reluctant to committing themselves to work with you. Now, how long of a term do you want? Well, with a listing agreement, we typically like what, maybe 6 months? Although if I was taking a listing right now, I might take it to the end of June because we know November, December sometimes can get to be a little slow period. And it takes a while in January for the market to pick back up again, right? But normally with a listing agreement with a seller, we like about 6 months. Now, ask yourself this. If you've got a ready, able, willing, motivated buyer, and you start showing them properties today, how long before they write an offer? Well, hopefully within a few days, right? No longer than a week if they're serious. What I'm getting at is, while you may take a listing for 6 months, this agreement is typically going to be for a shorter period of time, right? Maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month. Now, you certainly can take it for 6 months, but you don't really have to take it for that long. The shorter the time period, all right, the shorter the time period, the easier it is to get it signed. Now, I know you're thinking of that objection that's coming from the buyer. It goes something like this. You know, Mr. or Miss Agent, I like you. You seem like very knowledgeable. You look very nice. I mean, but we really don't know each other. And I hate committing myself to this agreement where, golly, what if it doesn't work out? What if we don't like each other? I don't mean to be rude, but I hardly even know you. This is how you handle that. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I understand completely. We've only just met. Tell you what, we are going to begin this contract today. November, what are we, the 6th? 5th. November 6th, November 5th, today's the 5th, right? November 5th. And we will end it at 11:59 on November 5, 2020. So it will end at midnight tonight. And then you can kind of joke with them. You weren't planning on looking at other properties with another agent this afternoon, were you? They go, well, no, great. We'll just make this agreement for today. And tonight it will expire. Now, would anybody have an objection of signing something like that? I don't think so. Now, some of you are thinking, well, that's all fine and good, Ed, but the problem is I show them 4 properties today, and then tomorrow, could they go out with another agent and buy one of those properties and cheat me out of a commission? Well, they could if it were not for the safety clause. So let me jump ahead a little bit and we get down to the second page, C, where it says right to compensation. Now, this is very similar that you'll find in a clause in the listing agreement, and it's called the safety clause. Now, you do have to fill in the protection period, and that's found under C2, where it says within 3 or blank, where it says C2 if within blank calendar days. All right. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, if you show a buyer today a property they want to buy it from somebody else, what's the longest period of time they'll wait before they write an offer on another property? Now, typically 30 days is enough. I like to use at least 45 days. You can do 60 days, you can do 180 days. But under C2, you need to put in a time frame. So if you put 45 days under C2 and they go out 2 weeks from now and buy a property that you showed them, they're going to still owe you a commission. Now, in order for this clause to take effect, you'll notice the second line to the bottom, it says within 3 calendar days, you need to inform them in writing of all the properties you showed them, you introduced them to, you told them about. So if you're in your conference room and you put up 5 or 6 listings from the MLS, then you would include those 5 or 6 properties in a letter to them and you need to send it to them within 3 days. So it would be going something like this. I take you out, I show you 4 properties. You like them and you say, I'd like to think about it for a little bit. I say, great. I'll touch base with you in a few days. I go back to my office, home office, brokerage office, whatever. I type up a letter and it says something like, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to show you properties today. Just to confirm, the properties we saw were, and then I list them in bullet points. If you have any questions about these properties or would like to see them again, please let me know. I will follow up with you in a few days. And then I mail that to her. Can you do it by email? Of course, but it has to be in writing. Please don't use a text because text can't be saved as effectively as either a letter or an email. Now I'm a bit old school. I tend to use a letter, but you can use email. Do you have to send it registered? No. If you want proof, show somebody in your office, your broker, your manager, the letter, fold it up, put it in an envelope, seal it, show them the stamp and the address, and put it at where your outgoing mail goes. You're good. You now have a witness that saw you submit that. So the nice thing about this is, go back to our term. I can take a listing for 1 day. And who wouldn't sign a listing for 1 day? And all those properties that I showed them today, as long as I, in writing, confirm with the buyer or prospective buyer of those properties. And if they buy one of those properties within that safety clause, remember I suggested using 45 to 60 days, I'm entitled to a commission. Okay, so we take out that objection. Under 1A, we're going to list the property that they're looking for. Now, we can do this a couple of ways. We can do it by location, that's A1, or we can do it by specific properties, that's A2, or we can attach a list of properties. Normally, you're going to go with location. So I might write in there San Gabriel Valley / Inland Empire. Or if you're working in the Orange County area, you might want to go CRMLS, right? Could you use Earth? That's a little broad, right? I mean, your license is only good in California, but I wouldn't go too big. Use the area that you think they may be interested in buying a property. Don't use an individual city like Walnut, because if they end up buying something in Hacienda Heights or Diamond Bar, technically this contract wouldn't be in effect. So you want to use a more general location. San Gabriel Valley, Inland Empire may work for you, but if you're working in the Orange County area, because I know this is the Tri-Counties, you might want to use something like CRMLS, right? Then a price range. Now here again, make it a little broad, but not too narrow. For example, if I have a buyer who's say in the 800,000 range, are they going to buy a house that's listed at 400,000? Now, if they're pre-approved for an $800,000 home, they're not going to buy a $400,000 house. I mean, it might be a nice house, but that's not what they're looking for. So if they're looking for an $800,000 home, and let's say they're approved up to 900, I may say 400,000 to 1.2 million. Why 1.2? Well, they can't qualify for anything at 1.2. So I've made the high range something they can't buy, and I've made the low range something they won't buy, right? So don't make it too narrow. Make your parameters just a little bit bigger. Now, if they come up to you, and sometimes this happens. I had a buyer come up to me years ago and says, Ed, I want you to help me buy a property. You're good at contracts, you're good at negotiations. This is the property I want. Go get them. One property. So that would be for 1A2. Or they may give you a list of properties. Maybe they're coming out of a 1031 exchange. They've identified 3 properties and they want you to represent them on one of those 3 properties. So they might get you a list, right? Remember, CAR forms, the goal is to be a little flexible to meet whatever situation you're in. So that's what 2 and 3 are for there. Typically what you're going to do is under A11, put in a location area that you're looking for and a general price range. Now, I think I had a, chat come in. Is Southern California too broad? Well, Raymond, I guess the question is, are you thinking about buying or representing somebody in, say, San Diego? And that may be, too far. So I would use CRMLS, but you could use Southern California if you think there's a real chance that you may be showing them properties in Santa Monica or in Indio, but yeah, you could use Southern California, but I think, you might want to be a little bit more narrow than that. All right. Okay. B says you're going to use due diligence and reasonable efforts. C, you will perform your obligations under this agreement. Now, in the next paragraph are agency relationships. Now, I'm assuming all of you are knowledgeable about agency. We talked about disclosure. We talked about confirmation. You'll do that in the purchase agreement. CAR and people in CAR have a big thing about agents because it is an area that gets some agents into trouble. And there are brokerage models out there that go under what we call buyer agency. They're really strong about single agency. So CAR has created 2 ways that you could stay in single agency. In other words, you couldn't go into dual agency. The first box there, brokers firm list properties for sale. If you check that box, you are saying you will not show the buyer any of your company's listings. If you don't show your buyer any of your company's listings, will you stay in single agency? Of course you will. Is that something your buyer wants? No, your buyer wants to see your company's listings too, right? They want to see all listings that might meet their needs. So don't check that box. The next one below that is broker's firm does not list properties. Now, there is a boutique business model out there called buyer brokerage, and they don't take listings. They only represent buyers. Now, I'm not a big fan of this model, but again, you can enter into whatever type of model you want to. But if you work for a firm that doesn't list properties, and I don't think any of you do, then you could check that box. Don't check that box just because you don't have any listings. No, if your firm lists properties, you can't check that box. But that would keep you in single agency. All right. D lets the buyer know that people in our company may be representing other potential buyers, that any offer you write, that offer is not considered confidential from the seller's perspective. That seller can share terms of your buyer's offer with competing buyers, nothing you can do about that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, F, we will confirm agency relationships in the purchase agreement. Now we get to the third objection, number 3, commission. Now you'll notice the first thing there, it says a notice that commissions are negotiable. That is actually required by the statute of frauds. So both in the listing agreement and in the buyer representation agreement, we have to have in 10-point bold type a notice that commissions are negotiable. Then under 3A, we have the compensation. Now, this is the next objection. Let me first explain how you fill it out, and then we'll talk about the objection and how to overcome it. Now, hopefully Laura is not listening because I have to talk about commission amounts. And we know that commissions are negotiable, and any discussion about a set commission amount could be viewed as a violation of antitrust laws. However, as an educator, I need to explain how to fill out this form. So I'm going to talk about numbers. Now, when you take a listing, you need to take a commission, typically in an amount where you can share part of that commission with another agent who's representing a buyer, right? So hypothetically, if you take a listing with a seller, you charge that seller 6%, you may be giving 3% to the agent with the buyer. If you take a listing at 5%, you may give 2.5% of that, or half of it, to the buyer agent, right? That's how it works. Now, the amount of your commission, I don't care. Commissions are negotiable. I'm not recommending a commission amount, but that's typically how it works on the listing side. This agreement that we're discussing today is on the buyer side. So if in the MLS, you want to see an amount offered to you at 3%, in other words, that's what you'd like to get, then under 3A1, you would write 3%. If you are happy with a 2.5%, then under 3A1, you would write 2.5%. You wouldn't put 6% because most agents representing buyers are not getting 6%. The seller may be paying 6%, but that is split between the two agents, the agent with the listing representing the seller and the agent writing the offer representing the buyer, right? You're on the buyer side. So you're going to be doing typically that amount that you see in the MLS, be it 3%, 2.5%, whatever. That's what you put in there. Now, there's also a space that you could add something else. Perhaps you're asking the buyer to pay for some expenses because you have to do traveling. Perhaps you're asking your buyer to pay for a transaction coordinator, which I don't recommend. That's a different class, okay? Not a good idea to ask your buyer, your client, to pay for a transaction coordinator. That's an expense you should pay for from what you're receiving in your commission, right? Or 3A2, you could charge them a flat fee. Or 3A3, you might have a compensation schedule. What's a compensation schedule? Well, if you do commercial leasing, it's not unusual that the compensation for the agent representing a landlord who goes out and finds a commercial tenant, their compensation is based on the term of the lease. In other words, if they lease it for 1 year, they may get X% of the first year's lease. If they lease it for 5 years, they may get X% of the 2 first year rent, Y% of the 3rd and 4th year's rent, and Z's% of the 5th year's rent. They do a schedule. If you're not involved with commercial leasing, don't worry what I just said. Are you going to be using 3A2 or 3 anyway? No. You're going to go down to 3A1 and you're going to put in what? Probably 3%, because that's what you'd like representing the buyer, right? Any questions on that other than the objection? And the objection is what? I don't want to pay a commission. I thought the seller paid the commission. Why are you asking me, the buyer, to pay commission? Common objection. And that's the number one reason why most agents don't want to use their form. They're afraid of that objection. And here's how you handle it. Let's go to the next page. And at the top of the next page, it's entitled Compensation, Payments, and Credits. And what it says in bold type here, if anyone other than the buyer compensates the broker for services covered by this agreement, then that amount will be credited. In other words, if you take this agreement with your buyer at 3% and you receive 3% through the MLS, it will offset and your buyer pays nothing. What if you receive 3.5% from the other agent representing the seller? You get 3.5%. Well, what if the MLS says 2.5%? But this agreement here in front of you says 3%. Would your buyer owe that difference of 0.5%? Well, contractually it would. But this is what I recommend. If you find a situation where the MLS is offering 2.5%, but your agreement says 3%, you waive that difference, because you shouldn't be punishing your buyer for signing this agreement and giving you loyalty because the MLS is offering 2.5. If you're happy with that 2.5 through the MLS, then you should take the 2.5 through the MLS and waive that half that they're contractually obligated because this contract says 3%. Now, here's something you also need to do. You need to sit down with your broker or your manager and say, I attended a class at my association today, Tri-Counties, and I now have decided I'm going to use the buyer representation agreement, and I am going to put in there 3%. However, I want your permission to waive 0.5% if in the MLS they're only offering 2.5, because if we as a brokerage company are happy taking 2.5, and that's what everyone else here in this office is doing, I don't think I should be punishing my buyer because they gave me the loyalty by signing a buyer representation agreement. Does that make sense? And I think your broker or manager will be on board with that. But sometimes brokers or managers can get a little stuffy if they see an opportunity to try to get more commission. Now, let's get back to the objection. You say to your buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, in all likelihood, I am going to be compensated from the seller. And I will be compensated hopefully with 3%. It will offset. You will owe nothing. Now, you may have a savvy buyer out there who says, well, what about 2.5%? I understand there's a lot of listings in the MLS and they only offer 2.5%. This is what you say to your buyer. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if we do find that situation, I will let you know in advance, and I will give you something in writing if necessary that you will not owe the difference. You will not owe that additional 0.5%. But let's wait until we get there, because before we write an offer, I will let you know what the financial situation is. They say, well, what do you mean? And this is when you have to show the buyer the benefits of this agreement. You see, here's your script. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, let me tell you a little secret of real estate. And unfortunately, a lot of buyers and sellers don't know this. There is a model out there known as what I call entry only listing. You may have seen ads where agents are saying, we will list your property and put it in MLS for $1,000 or $995 or something like that. You guys have all seen those ads, right? Yeah. What they do is they list your property for a flat fee that you pay them up front. Then they put it in the MLS, but they only offer $2.50. And they write in the confidential remarks, if you have a buyer and you want more commission than $2.50, please work that out with the seller. And you know what, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer? Those properties don't sell. You know why they don't sell? Because agents are not going to show a listing to their buyer if they think they have to fight for their commission. They are going to see that $2.50 and they're going to ignore that listing, and that buyer will never see that property. But you know, with this agreement, you are now empowering me not only to show you those properties, but to negotiate my commission directly with that seller and get my commission so you don't have to pay it. I'm assuming those are your instructions to me, right? Of course, they'll say, of course, exactly. I have to follow your instructions because we are under a buyer representation agreement. So here's how it's going to work. I see a listing out there that I think is perfect for you. I look down and I see the compensation. I call the listing agent, confirm its availability, confirm with them that I can talk to the seller about my commission. They say, go show it. I call that seller, tell them I have a buyer. The seller's enthusiastic because no one has come out to see their property. Why should they for a $2.50 commission? And I tell them, after talking to your agent, I understand that I'm to negotiate a 3% commission with you. They look at you, well, yeah, I guess that's right. Yes, that's right. Great. Can I show the property this afternoon? You take your buyer out, you show them the property, buyer comes back, let's write an offer. You write the offer, go meet with the seller, give them the agency disclosure, give them the PRBS, but before you present your offer, you give them the single party compensation agreement, known as the SP, Sam Paul, single party compensation agreement, or the SP form that's available in zip forms for you. That creates an obligation for the seller to pay you a commission, but it doesn't create agency with the seller. You can still stay in single agency with your buyer, but your seller is now obligated to pay a commission. Do not write your commission on the offer. I know a lot of agents make that mistake. The offer is between the buyer and the seller. You're not a party to it, so it's unenforceable. Moreover, the offer does not contain in 10-point bold type a notice that commissions are negotiable. Therefore, it would violate the statute of frauds. So you have to use that SP form. Then once the seller signs the SP form, you can present your offer. And then they'll either accept or counter, and you can put your deal together. The seller will pay the commission. Why will the seller pay the commission? Because the sellers think they're supposed to. Everybody knows, right? Sellers pay the commission. So that's how you get over that objection. But there's another benefit here you could say to your buyer. You say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, because now this agreement allows me to go out and negotiate my commission with the seller, you've given me permission to do that. I can now go to for sale by owners. I can go to off-market properties, unlisted properties. You tell me that there's a property you saw 6 months ago at an open house in some neighborhood. Can you tell me that address? I'll look up the square footage. I can have the title insurance companies pull up all the properties in that neighborhood with the same square footage. In other words, they have the same floor plan. I can contact them by letter, by telephone, to see if they're interested in selling their property. I can't do that very well without this agreement because they might be on the do not call list. If they're on the do not call list, I'm not supposed to solicit a listing, but I'm not soliciting a listing because I have a buyer. I'm under contract to represent you. Since I'm not soliciting a listing, I'm not obligated to follow the do not call list. This agreement gives me so much more authority and flexibility to represent your interest effectively. Oh, I know you're still a little concerned about this thought of compensation. Let me put it to you this way, and here's the deal, okay? The only way a buyer would ever have to pay a commission, and I've already explained that typically the seller will pay the commission. The only way a buyer would ever have to pay a commission is if you show them a property that is what? Not on the MLS. Is anybody going to show a buyer a property not on the MLS without this agreement signed? No. So the only way a buyer would ever have to pay a commission is if you show them a property they never would have seen without this agreement. And does the buyer really want to take that chance of missing out on the perfect property? Particularly when, in all likelihood, we can get the seller to pay a commission, right? So hopefully that has overcome any concerns any of you might have about a buyer raising an objection, because remember, there's only two: the term of this agreement and paying of commission. Now, I think I saw another chat, and I did. Let me go down there and see what it says. For 3A1, can an agent list a range rather than a fixed commission, or indicate the commission based on what it is in the MLS? And the short answer is no. And here's why. If you give a range, what is that? That doesn't create an enforceable agreement. You wouldn't take a range on a commission with a listing, right? You might range the property in terms of its price, but you don't go out and take a listing and say, okay, I'll list your price between 4 and 6%. Then you get a buyer. Well, what's the commission? Is it 4%, 5%, 6%? No, you can't list it on a range because it wouldn't be an enforceable agreement. Or indicate the percentage based on what's in the MLS. We don't want to do that, because what happens if it's a $2.50 listing, right? All those listings you've seen in the MLS at $2.50, now you're stuck at that as your commission. You don't want that. You want 3%, okay? Let's see, does C2 entitle me to a full BAC if the buyer was working with an agent? I don't know what a BAC is. Let's call it a commission. This agreement entitles you to the full commission that you state here in 3A1. So if you put in 3% and your buyer goes and writes an offer with another agent during the term of this agreement, then you're entitled to that 3% under 3A1. Here's something else for you. We all know that developers of new home tracts will frequently pay a commission to an agent who brings in a buyer. But you have to bring that buyer in and register them. And what happens? Sometimes your buyers go and look at those tracts without you, and that broker's not going to pay you a commission. So what do? Well, if you have this signed by your buyer, let me tell you exactly what you're going to do. That buyer is going to call you on Monday morning, because they always do. Why? Because they went out and looked at a property on Sunday and they wrote an offer, right? And it's going to go something like this. I think we did something bad. What did you do? Well, we went to a new home subdivision and we wrote an offer. Oh, is that bad? Well, would you still like my help as you go through the transaction? Would you like to be able to call me if you have any questions? And they'll say, of course. What can you do? Sure. What development was it? Who was the agent that you worked with? Now, don't call that agent, right? I mean, agents that sit open houses, okay, you need to talk to their manager. And this is how your script's going to go. Mr. Manager, a little bit of a communication problems. I have a buyer who went into one of your subdivisions, and that manager is going to cut you off and say, you know the rules, agent. You need to bring that buyer in and you need to register them. If you don't register them, you don't get anything. That's the rule. And you say, yes, I know the rule. But what you need to understand is I have a buyer representation agreement exclusive with my buyer. And that buyer is now obligated to pay me a 3% commission on the sale of your property. And I have pre-qualified them, and I do not believe they can pay the commission and buy your property. I would hate for them to lose this house because they seem to really like it. Frankly, I'd hate for you to lose the sale because that's what's going to happen. You're going to lose the sale if I enforce this agreement. So what I would like to do is send over a copy of this agreement. You can go over it with your attorney and we can work this out. And they're going to work it out with you every time. And here's why. What you may not realize is when you look at a new home subdivision, those houses are built in phases. You see, when phase one is selling, they are under construction with phase two. They've got phase three ready to go, but they can't get financing on phase three until they first sell a certain percentage of homes or get a certain percentage of homes in escrow in phase one. And if you kill one of your deals, that manager is going to have his or her you know what on the line with the developer, because that developer is now really excited that they got another property under contract and they can get their financing for phase three, and you just shot a hole in their financing in phase three. They're not going to give up a deal. It's too important for them. For what they see is a measly little commission. It's a big commission to you, but it's a pittance for them when they weigh the fact that they're going to have to delay phase three or phase four because they can't get their financing. So again, this gives you the ability to negotiate with new developers if something like that plays in. I have another item in the chat. Let me look at that and see what it says. Looks like I've got everything. So maybe that was just an old item. All right. So we've got the compensation out of the way. I've already talked to you about the safety clause under C1 and 2. Remember, under C2, what time period you want to put in? I'd say 45 to 60 days, 45 days or 60 days, not 45 to 60 days, no, 45 days or 60 days, 90 days, whatever you want. 30 days is a little short. And then remember, within 3 calendar days of showing of this contract's expiration, you need to contact that buyer in writing with the list of the properties that you showed them, and then you will be protected should they buy one of those properties within the time period in C2, which I said was what? 45 days or 60 days, right? Paragraph D talks about the timing of your compensation, typically close of escrow. Then we'll go down to paragraph G. Now, the reason they have paragraph G is because of paragraph C. Here's the deal. It is possible that you may run into a buyer who was under a buyer broker agreement with another agent, and they're still under their safety clause. So whenever you meet with a buyer, you always want to say what? Are you working with any other buyers at the present time? Are you under an agreement with a buyer? Have you ever entered into a buyer representation agreement with another agent? And they may say, yeah, we did. We had one of these with another agent. Really? When did that expire? Oh, about a week ago. Did you receive anything in writing from that other agent with a list of properties that they showed you? Yes, they did. I wasn't sure why they sent that to me. I know why. Could I see your earlier agreement and could I see the list of those properties? Because what I need to do under G2 is I need to exclude those properties, because if I write an offer on one of those properties, you could owe me and your earlier agent a commission. And you don't want to owe 2 commissions on a transaction, okay? Now, likewise, you could be taking up a buyer who might have another property in a transaction with another broker. So you can exclude other brokers from this agreement under G1, all right? Don't get too stressed over paragraph G. So few agents even use this agreement. so few agents even know about this agreement, the chances of you running into a buyer who is under one of these agreements with another agent is almost nil, right? But because we have a safety clause there in C, we have to have a way of excluding brokers or properties under G, right? The same thing is true in your listing agreement. You may not be aware of it, but there is a safety clause in the listing agreement, and there's also an exclusion clause in the listing agreement. The same thing, all right? Let's see, I think I have another chat. Let's see, I had a buyer who signed new construction. The new construction agent called the buyer and told them that they could lower the buyer price by the amount that would be paid to their agent. Well, yeah, same thing. If you have this buyer representation agreement signed, you are in the driver's seat. So I don't care what that other agent who's sitting the new home construction model home office says to your buyer. If your buyer tries to go around you, you have an enforceable agreement that will allow you to take a commission from that buyer. That will allow you to effectively kill the deal. Not that you want to do that. And you don't want to say that to your buyer because you want a good relationship with your buyer because you want to get referrals from your buyer. You do not talk to that agent who's sitting the model home, right? It doesn't take any skills to sit a model home. I apologize if any of you are a new home model agent, right? You talk to their manager. Their manager has to go to weekly meetings with the developer where their developer is yelling at them to sell more homes. You talk to their manager and say, look, manager, I don't want to have to kill this deal, but I'm entitled to a commission from my buyer. And I would hate for them to lose this house. Trust me, when they see a copy of this buyer representation agreement, they're going to fold. They're not going to risk losing a deal. And your buyer does not have to know what you're doing. You don't have to get into the uglies with your buyer, all right? All you have to do is talk to the manager, okay? Worked this before. It does work, all right? All right, let's move on now. Paragraph 4 simply advises the buyer that properties they're going to see, been advertised on the internet, blogs, and social media. So their house is exposed should they buy this house. Don't be surprised if it's still showing up on the internet because a lot of these blogs and social media sites don't take the information down when the escrow closes. Paragraph 5, your authorizations of what you're entitled to do, okay? Search out properties, locate properties, assist the buyer with financing, etc. Also states that you don't determine what the buyer is going to pay for the house or anything like that. We go over to the next page. Oops. Scope of broker duty. Again, the limitations, you don't, again, like I mentioned before, you don't determine what the buyer pays for a house or anything like that. Paragraph 7, nice little paragraph. It says that the buyer agrees to get pre-qualified or pre-approved by your lender within 5 days. So you want your lender to do a full approval process on your buyer within 5 days, so you know you have a legitimate buyer. Because we're in COVID, you should be doing that anyway. Let me expand this a little bit so it looks a little easier to see. All right. And then paragraph 8, if you want to do any other terms. Paragraph 9 is our attorney's fees clause, if you are the prevailing or winning party. Paragraph 10 says this is the entire agreement. There are no other agreements. Let me move on. And then paragraph 11 is our mediation paragraph. So if you have a dispute with your buyer, you agree to mediate before you file suit. Or if you've added the arbitration addendum, you agree to mediate before you go into arbitration. And then the buyer signs it, okay? Now, let's do some takeaway points. And then what I'm going to ask Laura to do is go ahead and open up the mics and we can have a discussion. Remember, your buyer is reluctant to signing. Make the agreement for 1 day. And then make sure you register all the properties under the safety clause, which means if they buy any of the properties that you showed them, you're entitled to your commission. Now, you may have a situation where the buyer is reluctant to signing and say, well, what if I want to use somebody else? Then I would respond back by saying, you know, if I show you a property today and it's what you want, I would hope you would give me the honor of writing that offer and representing you. And they say, well, I might want to have somebody else do it. You might want to say, well, who? They might want to say, well, my cousin. At that point, you need to say what? Sign this agreement or get out of my office, because that buyer is not going to work with you. There are a lot of buyers who have a relative or a friend who's new in the business or maybe not very competent, but they feel an obligation to give them the business, but they're not sure they showed them all the properties. So they would like you to go out, show them properties, and then take their business to someplace else. You don't want to waste your time with those people, right? Remember, in most cases, the seller will pay the commission. Buyer doesn't have to worry about the commission because there'll be that offset. The only way a buyer will ever risk paying a commission is if they want to buy a property they never would have seen unless they signed the BRE, right? And we've already shown that the seller's going to pay the commission anyway. The BRE allows agents to show all properties, listed, not listed, etc., to buyers and provide greater service. And the BRE protects your commission. Now, you know the two objections, commission and term. You know how to overcome each of those objections. If you have a buyer who will not give you a reason, they just don't want to sign it, they have a reason. They just won't tell you. And typically, the reason is they've got another agent they want to use. And don't work with them. The other thing to remember is don't go out and show buyers properties until first they sign this agreement. Once they know you will show them properties without signing this agreement, then they know that there's what? No reason to sign the agreement. So make sure you have the buyer sign the agreement before you show them properties. Now at that point, I have finished my presentation. I do not see anything in the chat room, but some of you may have a verbal question that you just want to chat about. So if you can unmute your mic in the lower left-hand point of your screen, or if Laura, you need to unmute their mics, I will take questions from any of you on this agreement, on concerns you have about it, or negotiating strategies. Anything?
They can unmute themselves if they want.
Okay. Oh,
They
we
have
got
the,
somebody who's shy coming into the chat. Let me see here. Oh, thank you, Rita. I'm glad you enjoyed the class. Any other questions? Sounds like I did a good job. Or I did a horrible job and they just can't find it out to talk to me. But usually if I don't get any questions, I covered pretty much all the points. Well, at that point, if there's nothing else, Laura, I'll let you sign us off.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending. And thank you, Ed.
Okay, you're very welcome. Thank you much.
Okay. All right. We'll see you next year.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.